Let's talk about the basics of betting in poker. This is going to be a very, very basic explanation, assuming you have no knowledge of how to bet. For an experienced player, this will all be review. But if you'd like to know what raise and call, check, those terms mean, that's what we'll cover. So if you think about poker, normally players going around the table and making bets on their cards, we're going to actually change the orientation of our play here. And I'm going to visualize it as those players sitting in a line. As I think this will allow you to visually see what is going on with their bets and how the mechanics work. So the goal of any round of betting in poker is to end up with the bets equalized between the players, that every player has wagered the same amount in that round. So to show you what I mean, let's say our first player makes a bet of 1. Currently these players have not bet, so the pot is not yet equalized between them. Now it's this player's turn to act, and they will call this bet, which simply means match the amount of the current high wager. The previous person's bet, the one sitting next to you. So they've matched the one and called the bet. Let's say player 3 also calls the bet, matches the high bet of 1, and player 4 also calls. Now you see we've gone around the table, and each player has bet the same amount. Each has bet 1 here. In this moment, all the bets are now equal, and so we can move on from this betting round. Typically, going to deal another card, and there will be more betting, or we might end the hand by showing what players have. So that's a very simple example of calling in poker. Now, let's look at the raise. So again, let's just say our first player bets 1. Different poker games may define how the first player will bet, with a blind or a bring-in. But for now, we'll say this player bets 1. Now this player calls the bet by matching it. Calling is matching. This player, however, wants to raise. So to keep playing, they either need to call. If they don't want to bet, they would need to fold. They don't want to put in more money. But this player wants to raise. They want to increase the wager in the pot. So they're going to put down an additional chip. So now the high wager is 2. These players have only bet 1. And now we come to this player. If they don't want to make that bet, they could fold. To keep playing, they need to at least call the bet or match the bet. Now, we've gone around and the bets are not equal. So we keep going around the table, so we loop back to this player. They don't want to play, so they're going to fold. Their money comes into the pot. They've lost what they've already wagered. This player has seen that the bet has raised to 2. They could call, and then we'd be complete because all bets are equal. But this player says, hey, I'm actually going to raise again. And they raise it another one. Not saying this is a good strategy or not. This is just for example purposes. Now this player who did the original raise is below the new high wager of 3. So to continue the hand, they will need to call. And same for this player. Now they could raise again, and we keep going. There will often be a limit to the number of raises in a hand, depending on the house rules. But if this player calls, we now see each has bet 3. The hands have equalized, and we can go on to the next round, which will just have these 3 players in it. So that is calling and raising. We saw an example of the fold. If you don't want to match the bet on the table because you don't feel your hand is good enough, you can fold to leave that hand. There is another option called checking, which is not available in all cases. In a game of Hold'em, there are initial required bets, the small blind and the big blind, where those 2 players are required to post a bet. And this just starts the betting action. Now, when the betting starts after these required bets, right, the high wager is currently 2, so to call, you'd have to match that 2 to play the hand. Subsequently, this player also call. Right, so we've gone, we had the blinds, we've had these bets, and we've come back around to the small blind. And with the small blind, right, they only put in 1, so bets are not equal. So they need to remember at least match the high wager on the table. So to call, they would add 1 additional chip, and our bets would be equalized. Now, this player, they had a mandatory small blind, so they couldn't enter a larger bet. If they wanted to raise, they could call that. They could match the bet by adding 1, and then they could raise an additional 2, so the bet now being 4. And from this point, right, it's unequal again. We're going to go, and these players need to decide if they would call, fold, or raise. In a game with blinds like this, that minimum raise has to be at least as large as the bet that was entered, or the largest raise. So in this case it was 2, so the raise was a minimum of 2. So now if these players want to call, they would have to match that. There can be nuances to the value of raises in different rounds of different games, so do check with your house rules, but the point here really is just with the blinds. It's a way to start betting action. You still need to get everyone equalized to continue. Now that small blind, big blind situation had required bets, and those typically happen in the first round of betting in a game of poker. Stud may require, say, the low card showing to make the first bet. And there's a required amount. In subsequent rounds, there will be a player identified as the one who starts the betting action, whether it's their placement relative to the dealer or based on the cards they have showing will vary by the specific game you are playing. But if there is no required bet in a round of poker betting, the player acting first may choose to check. And in this case, they are saying, I'm not going to make an additional wager. I'm not going to enter a bet at this time. Now, if they check, other players can also check until a bet is made. So, second player says, oh, I'm not going to add any more to the pot either. Third player says, I'm going to bet one. So now that there is a bet entered on the table, there can be no more checks in this round. Players must equal the highest wager to continue playing. So the fourth player does not have an option to check in this game. Can call, stay in, and now it comes back to our first player who needs to either fold if they don't want to make the bet, call, or they'll have an option of a raise over that bet. This player checked. If they could fold if they don't want to play, but if they did want to stay in the action, just wanted to see who was going to bet, they could call. This player could call. Now you just, to stay playing, need to match the highest wager. No one else wanted to raise. We've been around, equalized the bets, and play will continue. So it's very straightforward. All you're trying to do with betting is you go until you have equalized everyone's bets. They have the same value of chips staked in that round. Okay? There is one other option. Let's get some bets down. The pot's getting pretty juicy here, say. So people have made some bigger bets. And let's say we get to this third player, and the problem is they don't have 4 chips. Let's say they only have 2 remaining. So they can't match the highest bet on the table, which is 4, right? And that's what we've said is required to stay in the hand. You have to call or fold. However, and if this player had weak cards, they would obviously definitely fold. However, if they feel very strongly about their hand, they are allowed to go all in, which means bet the maximum, all the chips that they possess, even though it's insufficient to call a previous bet. So this player only has 2, but they can say all in, and they can still play this hand. This fourth player still has to match the total on the table, so they would need to bet 4 to stay in the game. So this is a case where the pot in this round is not equal, which we said was the rule. But what happens is this player can only play for that amount, and you start building side pots among the players still in for values more than that. I won't go too deep there, but all in just is a bet you can make if you want to play, even though you can't match the wager on the table. Alright, so you can bet, call is matching the bet, raise is where you match and then add additional to get a higher value wager on the table. Check is in rounds with no required bet. You can choose not to enter a wager as long as no wager has been entered. As soon as someone makes a wager, placing a bet, check is not an option, and players need to call or raise. So when we say limit poker, there is a fixed limit on what you can bet. It works the same as I have just described. The only difference is the amount that you can bet and raise is defined by that limit. It is in fact mandatory. So let's just use an example of a $2 limit. In a $2 limit game, to enter a wager, it must be of the value of 2. This player cannot bet 1 in a $2 fixed limit game. They will need to bet 2. So this player to call is going to have to put in 2 to match the bet on the table. Now we've come to our third player. To call, they'd need to put in 2. But they want to raise. So the raise also has to be the $2 limit. So a raise of 2. This player can't raise 1. They can't raise 3. They have to raise according to the limit, which in this case is 2. Now for our fourth player, too rich for them. They're going to fold. We have an unequal pot. This player will call to match the high wager in this round, and this player could call, and if they want to raise, they would have to raise by 2, making the total 6, and now these players would have to match that. So to call, they would have to go to 6 as well. And now all players have equalized, and we would proceed with the hand of poker. So when you see fixed limit, it is quite straightforward. You just have to bet or raise in increments of the limit. Often you will see the limit expressed as a slash value, say $2, $4. And what that means is in the initial rounds, use the smaller limit of the 2, and in later rounds, you use the limit of 4. So in stud poker, in the first 2 betting rounds, where we have a 2 in a $2 and $4 game, players will have to bet the 2. They would raise 2. And everything would be in terms of that $2 limit. That would happen for the first 2 betting rounds. 3rd Street and 4th Street. I have 3 and 4 cards still. Then when you get to 5th Street, or depending on what your game you're playing, there's a point where it switches to the large bet, the big bet. So now, where before, to start the wager, you had to put in 2, this player now has to wager 4. This player would have to bet 4 to call. If they wanted to raise, they'd have to put in the 4 to match, and then the raise has to be 4 as well, because that is our limit, bringing the total to 8. So that's the key element of a fixed limit game. no limit, players can choose the amount that they bid. In fixed limit, it must be according to the value of the increment, whether that's the small bet or the big bet, depending on the round of poker. There are also pot limit games, which limit the bets to the total value in the pot. And I'm not going to dive into that there. Not too complicated, but focus on the basics here. 7-card stud is almost always played as a limit game. So let's dive into the details of how the bet mechanics work in 7-card stud.